The science of murder, the analysis of dangerous new psychedelic drugs, and the fingerprints and trace evidence left behind by suspects at crime scenes are just some of the topics that I'm going to be discussing with a panel of forensic science investigators later this month. And you can come along for free. A special public event to celebrate 50 years of Forensic Science Ireland is going to take place at the National Convention Centre in Dublin on May 28th. The doors are at 6 p.m. and tickets are available now on eventbrite.com. Don't miss it. The last time we saw Scott Delaney, also known as Scott Knight, was near enough to the office, pulling on a crack pipe.
Yeah.
Having come from many protests where he was sort of, drumming people up to come out, sort of that far right mentality to come out in anti-immigration. Of course, he has an interesting past himself, but he's for somebody so high and mighty, he's now behind bars in the UK.
Yeah,
he's been jailed for drug offences.
He's been jailed for drug offences. I mean, yeah, he's a funny sort of mix of stuff going on, because
he's a lot going on, hasn't he?
He's a lot going on. I mean, he's obviously he became a very prominent anti-immigration campaigner, Scott Delaney.
Did he change his name to Scott Knight?
He changed his name to Scott Knight. Obviously, the reason he changed his name was because he was at the centre of a very, very notorious murder trial back in the 90s, the savage murder of a guy called Mark Dwire. Ultimately, his father was convicted of and sentenced to life in connection with that murder.
Cotton Eye Joe Delaney, of course, was the one who used to make the headlines until he was jailed for life in relation to that murder. We'll come back to the details of it. He was a really significant player in the Ecstasy scene when it sort of first emerged in the 1990s in Dublin, and a really violent criminal. But in recent times, even if you Google Cotton Eye Joe Delaney, it's the activities of his son that keep popping up, because he sort of has become a bit of a media player. He likes to make commentary himself. He's given interviews, I think, in the past, and he had his own little sort of YouTube channel, or certainly he was giving out information about himself and his activities on that.
Yeah, I mean, he's done a couple of interviews with sort of crime podcasts, so he also...
Like what?
Well, I was just saying... I can't remember the exact name of it. So it's a funny sort of mix of things where he
left that there.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm sort of I'm just saying you can't.
Anyway,
no, he did. He definitely didn't do it here.
He did some in the UK.
He did some in the UK.
Came back. Listen, he was gone for years, wasn't he? In the UK, he was living in Manchester, and
so he's come back. He came back, obviously. Probably you can see now why he's come back, because he was effectively on the run in relation to drugs charges in the UK, and he came back and lived here, and he was involved with some boxing coaching as well, but really he started springing up as a far right influencer, for want of a better term.
Issues. He was worried sick about immigrants committing crimes.
He was worried sick about immigrants committing crimes, and he was also he would also do crime podcasts where I suppose you could say he glorified in the good old days of ecstasy dealing, where
he was so rich, didn't he?
Yeah, he said he was. Well, it probably was true that he was one of the most successful ecstasy dealers in Dublin. He certainly played a huge role in the beginning of the rave scene in Ireland in terms of supplying ecstasy in clubs like the Asylum or Sides at the time.
Now, get into the mindset of somebody like Scott Knight / Delaney, where he's coming from is it's okay to sort of drug deal, and previously he was caught in France with 2 assault rifles.
Yeah, well, what happened?
He's currently been jailed for is that the follow-up search found cannabis plants in his property in Manchester, which he was growing. So it's kind of like the mindset is it's okay to commit crime, really, once you're not an immigrant. But if you're an immigrant, it's really off the, it's just no.
So there was a famous club in Dublin called the Asylum, just off O'Connell Street, and it was probably one of the birthplaces of the rave scene in Dublin. I suppose, around 1990. And it's been converted the building has passed through many, many hands. But he did a series of videos from outside the asylum because it was being taken over by immigrants who were doing work. And so in his mind, I suppose the asylum was a sort of a holy place, because there was the good drug dealing, which was the ecstasy scene, which was a beautiful cultural moment.
Yeah.
And then there was the bad drug dealing, which was the genocide powder, as he calls it, which is heroin. Okay. So there was a huge distinction between the good drug dealing and the rave scene.
There's a disconnect there, because, of course, the ecstasy culture had all of that love and you know, fun and happiness and everything. But in the middle of it, and I think really the murder of Mark Dwire was the moment that people sat up and realised that ecstasy wasn't really all about love.
No, well, I mean,
it was even also, you know, a very dangerous environment where people were getting rich because they were buying these tablets, usually from Amsterdam, or many of people had plans to buy tablet presses and make them here in Ireland. They were selling them for, like, I think £10, we can say.
Well, you'd be wrong there. I mean, they started off at £20,
and they went down, did they, over
to £15 for a long time. So they were being made for almost nothing in Amsterdam.
I think was the word they were saying. They were buying them maybe even for that. It was such a huge markup, selling so many of them. Dance clubs had popped up, and there was a certain group of dealers who had seen the potential in this market. And Christy Kinahan, of course, himself had his own players within the market there, people he's still in contact with nowadays. But it was the start of something that made, where previous to Ecstasy's arrival, it was all about heroin.
Yeah.
And there were certain people who were never going to take heroin.
Never going to take
drug users. When Ecstasy came, it opened it up as this recreational drug that by and large wasn't going to kill you. There were a couple of high profile deaths from ecstasy, but by and large people went out at the weekend and they raved.
Yeah.
And they had a great time, and they went back to work.
Yeah. And so Scott Delaney would have been in that first wave of ecstasy dealers before it became, I suppose, industrialized with people like the Kinahans and, you know, who were able to move huge amounts. So really what he was doing was going over to the UK and bringing them home. And of course, the guards will have built up intelligence on people, like heroin dealers, and they'd have networks. You know, obviously they knew people, informers about all that scene. But I think the ecstasy scene, like a lot of these things, you know, they just simply didn't have the information about that. So I think Scott Delaney, his dealings weren't probably too sophisticated, but there was huge amounts of money and there was an endless demand. I mean, as people say about drug dealing, it's not supply and demand. There's endless demand. It's just how much you can supply. And that certainly was the way it was. But inevitably, the summer of love, or the couple of summers of love in Dublin, didn't remain. And
came to an end in 96 when Mark Dwire was
Well, it came to
killed.
Yeah, exactly. And even before that, there was violence that started to seep in, because where there's money and where there's drugs, eventually violence is inevitable. And
the Delaneys, like Cotton Eye Joe Delaney and his son Scott, they were from the South inner city, I think, were they?
Well, I think they were. Yeah, they certainly had an address in the South inner city. Scott Delaney had also lived in North Dublin as well for long periods of time.
And his father was a big player, like, and he was a very violent. He was very
his father was
able to kind of protect his patch.
Well, his father, I think, had been an armed robber, and he'd been associated with Martin the General Cahill on the fringes of that sort of organisation. But really, it was his son Scott who started off as the drug dealing.
Oh, really?
And the father kind of
linked onto it.
Right. And that's according to Scott. But I do think that to be the case, that the father kind of was brought in and sort of acted the heavy and brought in that level of violence. And Mark Dwire was accused by Cotton Eye Joe of 40,000 ecstasy tablets had gone missing, which is a huge amount of money. And Cotton Eye Joe, rightly or wrongly, blamed Mark Dwire. He was effectively kidnapped, tied to a chair, and beaten with iron bars for several hours. Ultimately, was killed. It became, I suppose, when it did come to court, it became, I suppose, the first of its type in terms of a murder trial.
Well, Cotton Eye Joe Delaney had also beaten up his own son in order to try and cover up the fact that he might have had anything to do with Mark Dwire's death. And he had left him, in a position that he was going to look like a victim too.
Yes, a total and utter psychopath, Cotton Eye Joe, absolutely. And ultimately, Scott gave evidence against his own father. He was originally convicted of murder, but this was quashed in appeal and he was sentenced to 5 years for a new charge of accessory to murder, so a far lesser charge. But his father
got the life sentence.
So after he came out of prison, Scott Delaney left ultimately and went to the UK. He was living in Manchester. I was one of myself and actually Donald McIntyre.
You went over with him?
Yeah, I went over with him. Yeah, we ultimately tracked him down.
Did he give you an interview at that stage?
He didn't give. He gave an interview to Donald at a later point. Where, funnily enough, like he was obviously an Irish immigrant living in the UK at that point.
And he had got caught up with some of either the football hooliganism or the far right movement.
No, the far right. I mean, he joined the BNP, the British National Party, which of course are notorious for their anti-Irish stance. Even while he was over there, he retained very clear contacts in the criminal world with two groups in particular, the Colopys in Limerick. He was at one point arrested while over down there in Limerick with them, and also with one of the factions of what was called the Sheriff Street feud, basically the Christy Griffin faction. So he retained those criminal contacts. So he was still involved suspected of being involved in criminality while in the UK, and he was obviously an Irish immigrant. But despite all that, he joined the BNP, the anti-Irish party, and he was very, he was very anti-Muslim, all of the same stuff that he retained.
Now, did he have a family there?
He had a family in Ireland anyway. I don't think he actually had a family in the UK at the time. So ultimately, he continued to get in trouble periodically back and forth to the UK. And as you spoke about, he was at one point caught bringing these weapons through the Channel Tunnel.
That was in 2015.
2015. And while those weapons were seized, the NCA were alerted and they raided a property in the UK where he had been living. And in there they found
80 plants and, with a possible yield of something like 50,000.
Which is quite a significant seizure. And at that point...
It's not heroin though, is it?
It's not heroin. It's not the genocide powder.
It's okay.
So at that point then, he was obviously convicted there was, I don't know if he was convicted, but certainly there was a warrant was issued for his arrest. And he has spent the last few years in Ireland, really. So what happened was he was over in Manchester again, and he was arrested in Holyhead in Wales on his way back to Ireland in March, and he's been convicted, given a 5-year prison sentence in the UK.
It's quite unusual when he did come back to Ireland initially, and it would have been probably around 2000, I suppose.
Yeah.
And he started showing up, as this far-right spokesman. And, he had a lot to say about immigrants committing crime.
Oh, totally.
Such a disconnect.
Yeah, there's loads of disconnected. I mean, when I saw him protesting outside the asylum, the club being taken over by foreign drug dealers, so look...
this was his accusation.
But this was his accusation.
And this was just some business.
But of course he'd
taken it over and they were...
Yeah, but of course he'd previously done lengthy interviews about selling drugs in the asylum. So look, it's a different mentality. But some of his posts were... certainly around the Crown Paints centre on the Malahide Road. He was very, very prominent in that, very much trying to get people down. He also called on people to vote for the National Party in particular. He
said, actually, it really is the best choice we have for saving our country and our people. If everyone was to give support to the National Party, Ireland would be in a far, far better place. No homelessness, no country destroyed with heroin and crack cocaine, the genocide powder, which we did view him
Yeah.
taking a puff of.
Yeah. So he
Taking a bit of a
again,
puff
it's
around the corner here.
and again, he also earlier this year he did a TikTok about how he wanted to set up a firing squad to kill paedophiles, where he would line them up against the wall he and his, whoever else he could get involved, and he would line them up and shoot them.
He's a fan of Enoch Burke.
He's a fan of Enoch Burke. You couldn't get him a less different background than Scott Delaney.
Sure,
but
he doesn't want him.
No, but he did used to organise Christmas cards and stuff to be sent into Enoch Burke. So look.
And he was travelled up to Belfast for that anti-immigrant protest as well, and was found on video doing that. But anyway, so he's locked up for a few years. We won't see him for a wee while.
We won't see him for a wee while. But
he's sitting there and think about
he was writing a book at the time, so maybe he will get a chance to finish that.
Get that finished, and then we can hear all about his philosophy on the world and life.
Yes.
Thank you, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.